In this lecture on the covenant, we are first going to discuss some general definitions. So what is a covenant? It is a promise bound by an oath, a binding agreement between two parties, entering into a binding relationship that did not previously exist, and it involves obligations. The Hebrew word is berit, and it can be used in the Bible in conjunction with marriage, a contract, a treaty, or a gift or grant. So God in the Bible, in relation to the people of Israel, is always the one who initiates a covenant. And God's covenant making is preceded by some kind of act of redemption, goodness, grace, or kindness. It does not come out of the blue. God's covenant with Abraham and then Israel answers the problem set out in Genesis 1 through 11. That problem is that God created a world and it was good. And humanity was created to be in intimate relationship with God. But humanity rebelled against God and became estranged. And so God seeks then to reconcile humanity to himself and to heal the wounds outlined in Genesis 1 through 11. Now the covenant with Abraham in Genesis 12 is basically unconditional. It's an unconditional promise. The Sinai covenant resembles suzerainty treaties that we have found that were created by the Hittites between kings and vassals. Vassals being those who were minor kings who then served a more powerful king of some kind. And what studying these treaties allows us to do is to bring out some aspects of the covenant between God and Israel, which we might otherwise miss. First of all, that it's not a covenant of equals, that there is a requirement for obedience, a fulfilling of obligations as a response to deliverance. It is sustained by the Lord's continuing actions on behalf of the people, and no obligation is placed on the Lord who is already pledged to Israel. And let's look at that in the context of the actual biblical passage. Look at Genesis 12, 1 through 3. God simply makes a promise. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And then in 17, there is the promise, but there is a stipulation. So here we see a transition perhaps to the kind of covenant we find at Sinai. So God reiterates his promise, and then he says, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your descendants. I will give to you land, and I will be their God. And then this stipulation, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. So here we have a stipulation, not only promise. In Exodus 6, you again have a restatement of promise. I established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they dwelt as sojourners. And here God also promises to deliver them, to be their God, to be their people, and bring them into the land. But in Exodus 19, again, there is a stipulation. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my own possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So let's take a closer look at those Hittite treaties. These are between usually a greater king and a lesser king, perhaps within the influence of the greater king. And it is the form here that we're looking at, not the theology. We're not saying that the covenant in Exodus is exactly the same, but that the format, the organization, is somewhat similar. First of all, in those treaties, you get the names and titles of the king or kings. You get a historical prologue. What is the background? Such as good deeds towards the vassal's motive for obligation is then gratitude. You have stipulations, and in these treaties there's a loyalty oath and a vowing to come to the aid of the king in time of war. It is stipulated that the covenant should be preserved and proclaimed publicly, and copies preserved in temples and read publicly once a year. There are witnesses to the treaties, the gods of both countries and the natural powers. And then there are sanctions, that is, there are blessings for keeping covenant and curses for unfaithfulness. Here is an example of one of these Hittite treaties. First of all, we have the preamble or introduction with the names and titles of the greater of the two kings. These are the words of the son Mursilis, the great king, the king of the Hatti land, the valiant, the favorite of the storm god, the son of Suppiluliumus, bit of a tongue twister there, the great king, the king of the Hatti land, the valiant. Then, historical prologue. Aziras was the grandfather of you, Dupitesub. He rebelled against my father, but submitted again to my father. When your father died, in accordance with your father's word, I did not drop you. Although you were ailing, I, the son, put you in the place of your father. The stipulations that are being imposed: with my friend you shall be friend, and with my enemy you shall be enemy. If anyone utters words unfriendly toward the king or the Hatti land before you, Dupitesub, you shall not withhold his name from the king. Fourth, the covenant is to be preserved. A duplicate of this tablet has been deposited before the sun goddess of Arinna, because the sun goddess of Arinna regulates kingship and queenship. Fifth, there are witnesses to the treaty. Here, the sun god of heaven, the sun goddess of Arinna, the storm god of heaven, the Hattian storm god, Ceres and Horus. And finally, sanctions. Should Dupitesub not honor these words of the treaty and the oath, may these gods of the oath destroy Dupitesub. But if Dupitesub honors these words of the treaty, may these gods of the oath protect him, together with his person, his wife, his son, his grandson, his house, and his country.